When we're weaving, we want to weave from the bottom of our loom to the top. We do not need to start on the very edge. We can come up about an inch or two from the edge. And I'm going to show you how to weave across the loom and then back and continue this pattern back and forth. I like to start on the left on the bottom and go over the first warp string, under the second, my strings are a little tight, over one, under one, over one, under one, and we continue that pattern over one, under one, all the way across the loom. When I get to the end, I want to pull the weft piece through. So the pieces of yarn that we are weaving across the warp strings are called the weft. And I want to leave this tail hanging off, about that much here at the end. And I can also pull this down just a little bit more. Here at the end, I'm going to go ahead and tie my weft piece. So I looped around, and now I'm going to go back through and pull it tightly. And I'm going to do that one more time. This way, the first part of my weaving, this weft, is attached to the warp, and I'm ready to keep working. Now when I pull this through, I don't want to pull it so tightly that it moves the warp string toward the center. I want to pull it just so it's snug, not pulling the warp string. I want to make sure the warp strings stay vertical. As I got to the end, I stopped on my last warp string over that piece. I'm going to find the end of my yarn, and I'm going to be weaving above my first line, and I'm going to start under. So I stopped over, so now going back the other direction, from right to left, I start under. Under one, over one, the same pattern. Under one, over one, all the way across. When I get to the end, I want to make sure that all of my yarn is nice and loose, that loop, and I want to pull the loop through, and I want to stop when the loop touches this warp string on the right. I don't want to pull it so tight that it pulls the warp strings together. Just want to be touching that last loop, that last warp string, and then I'm going to push with my fingers, push the yarn together so that these two rows are now tightly together. We can see if I was under this string on the bottom, I'm now over that warp string on the top with the weft. The weft ended on the last warp on the left under, so now I find my end. Sometimes it helps to put a knot at the end of our yarn because it does sometimes want to unravel. So I just tied that off. That will keep the yarn from unraveling. I finished under the warp string, so now I go back from left to right over the first warp string. Under the next, over one, under one, over one, under, all the way across. And we see this pattern of over, under. Now on my third row of my weft, I'm over again. When I get to the end of my loom, I'm pulling the weft through gently, making sure it doesn't knot up. and I'm pulling it until it just touches that warp string, and I'm pulling it down, pushing the strings, the weft pieces together. I think I can pull just a little bit more, making sure that my warp strings are nice and vertical. I stopped over on my last warp on the right. I find the end of my yarn, and with the weft I start above, and since I stopped over the warp, I go under the first warp string to get back across. Again, following that basic pattern of over, under, over, under. Pulling the weft piece through until it touches the warp, pushing it down so it's nice and tight against the previous 3 rows, and then gently pulling that just a touch more so that it's tight against the warp string, but not so tight that it's pushing these together. I'm going to continue this pattern, weaving back and forth with this first color until I run out of the color. And then I'll show you what to do to start your next color. Since I ended under this last warp on the left, to go back to the right, I start over. I was under here, so now I'm over the first, and I'm going to finish up with the green. I continued our pattern of weaving from left to right, back to the left, weaving through, and I've noticed when I got to the end that the weft piece is not going to be quite long enough to go all the way back across without leaving me anything to tie to. So I'm going to go ahead and tie the next piece of yarn to this piece. So my weft is now going to change from green to blue. I'm going to make an X with the strings, and we just make a square knot, which is that first step of tying our shoes 2 times. So X, and then back through the center again, pulling this tight. I like to pull them together to make sure that they're nice and tightly tied. When I cut the tails, I don't want to cut too much off because I don't want the strings, the pieces to pull apart. And now I'm going to start weaving back through with my next color. I want about the same amount of color of yarn. If I want it to be thicker, I'll use more yarn, thinner, less yarn. And we can create a pattern, or we can just keep changing colors. I'm going to tie a knot in the end of my yarn before I move on so that that doesn't come apart. And I still have to look at my last warp string and decide how to get back to the other side. Since I stopped over, I'm going to continue through, starting under, above, under 1 over 1 all the way across. And we're going to have a goal of weaving all the way to the top of our loom. We need to make sure that we are pushing the weft rows tightly together, because if we have a loosely woven weaving, it won't stay together well. And we want this to stay together very nicely. I'm going to pull the weft through gently, making sure it doesn't knot up on the end. Pulling through and then stopping when I touch this warp string, pushing down, and then just gently pulling. And I stopped under on the left warp, so now to get back above, I go over the first warp. Once we get that part to where we can do that very well. We will have no trouble at all finishing our weaving. It will just take time. Pulling the weft through. And stopping when the weft touches the warp. I don't want to leave that loop, so I'm just going to pull it a little tighter. I also like to pull these warp strings apart to make sure that my weaving is nice and straight. I'd like to share 2 examples of weaving. This example, we see that the student did a pretty good job of keeping the warp strings straight. It dips in a little in the center. We see that the weave is very tight. We don't see a whole lot of the warp strings. In this case, they're white. And we see some really good weaving nearing the top. So this one can continue all the way to about an inch or so from the edge. Here we also see some nice weaving. The problem that this student had was pulling the warp strings tightly. And what starts to happen is that the one on the edge can actually cross over and we lose our pattern. So this can be fixed by pulling the warp strings apart and making sure that we don't pull as tightly, since this yarn ends over the last warp string, which I can find by traveling all the way to the top and making sure that's the first one. I would start out under, over to get back through, and just making sure that I'm not pulling as tightly. If we ever need to tighten the warp strings at all, we can go to the back and pull them. If they get too loose, we can adjust on the back of the loom. The example that I was working on with you today, this one is nowhere near done, but this is a good place to stop so that you can get started. Do your best, and I look forward to seeing how your weaving goes.